She was the goddess of Hollywood, draped in white mink and diamonds. He was a brutal mafia enforcer, carrying a gun and a grudge. When their worlds collided, it didn't end with a kiss, it ended with a butcher knife. Lana Turner sought protection in the arms of Johnny Stompanato, looking for a real man among the fake heroes of the silver screen. Instead, she found a monster who threatened to carve up her million-dollar face. But the most shocking twist wasn't the abuse, it was the killer. On a blood-soaked night in Beverly Hills, the person who finally stopped the gangster wasn't the police. It was Lana's 14-year-old daughter. This is the dark, true story of how the mafia enslaved a movie star and how Hollywood turned a family tragedy into its biggest box office hit. But this bloody climax in Beverly Hills was merely an echo of the violence that birthed her. Lana was not born into diamonds. She entered the world as Julia Jean Turner in 1921 in a gritty, impoverished mining town in Idaho. Her life was haunted by a foundational trauma. Her father, John Virgil Turner, was killed in 1930 in an unsolved attack widely linked to gambling and robbery. The details remain murky, but the message to a child was clear. Safety could vanish overnight. The image of her father lying dead in the gutter, cold and unprotected, planted a primal fear in young Julia and an insatiable hunger for safety. Early on, she seemed to learn that the world wasn't safe for the poor or the powerless. When she and her mother moved to Los Angeles to seek a new life, Julia carried that shattered soul into the city of dreams, searching for a fortress that could never be breached. The moment Julia became Lana is one of Hollywood's greatest legends. A teenage girl, cutting class at the Top Hat Cafe for a soda, was spotted in a heartbeat and turned into a studio discovery story. She became the sweater girl, the girl in the tight-fitting knitwear that sent a shiver through the hearts of millions of American men. But at MGM, under the iron-fisted management of Louis B. Mayer, Lana was merely a pawn in the studio system. They taught her how to walk, how to stand, and how to smile, but they never taught her how to handle the crushing isolation of fame. The more famous Lana became, the more she was sequestered within her own aura. She married and divorced with dizzying frequency, forever searching for a man who could replace the ghost of her father, someone who could provide absolute protection. And then in the wreckage of her Hollywood romances, the underworld walked in. Johnny Stompanato was not a glamorous actor or a sophisticated director. He carried the scent of gunpowder and the raw, tangible power of the streets. To a Lana Turner exhausted by the artifice of the upper class, Johnny felt real. He was coarse, he was masculine, and he promised a level of protection that no studio boss could ever provide. When Johnny walked into Lana's villa, he brought the shadow of the mafia with him. He saw in Lana not a woman to be loved, but a valuable asset to be possessed. He infiltrated her life with expensive gifts and promises of security. But Lana did not know that the price of this protection was her freedom, and eventually her soul. From that moment on, the relationship stopped being romance and became control. Even standing at the absolute zenith of her career, Lana Turner remained a frightened child in the body of a movie star. She mistakenly believed that the shadow of the mafia could shield her from the storms of life. She did not yet realize that the shadow itself was the most devastating storm she would ever face. By the mid-1950s, Lana Turner was no longer just a woman. She was a multi-million-dollar industry. Her face was the hallmark of MGM's prestige, and her name was a guarantee of box office success. But while the white aristocracy of Hollywood sat in their boardrooms discussing her contracts, a different kind of power was quietly moving into her bedroom. Johnny Stompanato did not arrive with a fanfare. He arrived with a presence. He was a veteran of the Marine Corps and an associate of Mickey Cohen, one of Los Angeles's most notorious underworld bosses. Johnny understood something the studio moguls didn't. Lana Turner didn't want more money. She wanted to feel safe. He began his deadly protection by offering her a sense of security that was physical, raw, and undeniable. In the beginning, he was the perfect gentleman, a man of action in a world of pretenders. But as soon as the doors of her Bedford Drive mansion closed, the mechanism of possession began to grind. Johnny wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a territory. He viewed Lana's fame not as something to be shared, but as a resource to be mined. He began to systematically dismantle her life, replacing her friends, her advisors, and her staff with people loyal to him. He was building a wall brick by brick, not to keep the world out, but to keep Lana in. The transition from protector to predator was swift. Johnny's protection rapidly devolved into a regime of terror. He began to control every facet of her existence. He vetted her scripts, monitored her telephone calls, and insisted on being present on every film set. His jealousy was a pathological weapon. He wasn't jealous out of love, he was jealous out of ownership. He viewed every man who looked at Lana as a thief trying to steal his merchandise. The abuse became physical. In the privacy of her boudoir, the goddess of love was subjected to the most humiliating violence. Johnny knew exactly where to strike, so that the bruises wouldn't show on camera. He targeted her spirit as much as her body. He would remind her daily that without him, she was nothing but a fading sweater girl whom the studios would discard. But his most lethal weapon was the threat of disfigurement. He knew that Lana's face was her fortune, her identity, and her lifeblood. He would frequently hold a knife to her cheek or a lit cigarette to her eye, whispering, "If I can't have you, no one will ever want to look at you again." This was the logic of abuse. He tried to keep her by threatening to ruin the very thing she lived on. Lana lived in a state of permanent hypervigilance, walking on eggshells in her own home, terrified that one wrong word would result in the end of her career and her life. The true scale of Johnny's obsession was revealed in 1957 during the filming of Another Time, Another Place in London. Lana was cast alongside a young, rugged Scottish actor named Sean Connery. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and rumors of an affair quickly reached the ears of Mickey Cohen's crew in Los Angeles. Enraged by the thought of his property being touched by another, Stompanato made his way to London and showed up on set, armed and furious, before authorities removed him from the country. In front of the cast and crew, the gangster pulled a gun and aimed it at Connery's head, threatening to kill him for touching his woman. In a moment of real-life heroism that mirrored his future role as James Bond, Connery didn't flinch. He grabbed Johnny's wrist, twisted the gun out of his hand, and laid the gangster out with a single punch. It was a humiliating defeat for Stompanato. He was deported by Scotland Yard, but the damage was done. For Lana, the incident wasn't an escape, it was an escalation. Johnny returned to California more embarrassed, more unstable, and more dangerous than ever before. He blamed Lana for his humiliation, and the violence at home reached a fever pitch. By early 1958, Lana Turner was a hostage in a pink palace. She was a woman who had reached the pinnacle of the American dream, only to find it was a nightmare. She was trapped in a vicious loop, terrified to stay and terrified to leave. She knew that the mafia didn't allow people to simply walk away. She began to turn to alcohol and pills to numb the reality of her existence. Her daughter, Cheryl, watched from the shadows as her mother's light faded. The 14-year-old girl saw the bruises, heard the screams, and witnessed the man she was supposed to call Uncle Johnny transform into a monster. The black aristocracy had fully conquered the villa. MGM's executives looked the other way, as long as production stayed on schedule. No one was coming to save the Queen of Hollywood. She was going to have to save herself or die trying. The tragedy of Lana Turner was that she had traded the freedom of Julia Jean Turner for the cage of Lana Turner. She had sought a protector to heal the wound of her father's death, but she had instead found a man who would open new wounds every single day. The deadly protection was no longer a promise, it was a life sentence. The mansion at 730 North Bedford Drive was a masterpiece of Hollywood artifice, a pink-walled colonial designed to look like a sanctuary. But by the evening of April 4th, 1958, the interior felt like a pressure vessel. Lana Turner's bedroom was a sea of pastel silks and expensive perfumes, a white aristocracy dream that had become a stage for a black aristocracy nightmare. The air was heavy with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and expensive gin. Johnny Stompanato had been drinking since the early afternoon. He was wearing a dark silk blend shirt and slacks, the uniform of a man who wanted to look like a gentleman while acting like a thug. He spent the evening pacing the thick pile carpet, his footsteps muffled but his voice booming. Lana sat on the edge of the bed, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed but her eyes hollowed out by days of sleep deprivation. The argument wasn't about one thing, it was about everything. Johnny was enraged that Lana had begun to pull away. He had discovered that she was consulting her business manager about a separate bank account. To a mob enforcer, independence was a form of treason. "You think you're better than me because of those movies?" Johnny snarled, leaning over her so closely she could smell the bourbon on his breath. "You're nothing but a prop. I'm the one who keeps the wolves away. I'm your deadly protection. Remember?" Lana's voice was a ragged whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Johnny. The beatings, the monitoring, I'm done." That was the trigger. Johnny's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He didn't hit her this time. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small, flick-blade knife. He didn't open it, he simply tapped it against her cheek. "I'll give you a choice, Lana. You stay, or I'll make sure your face is something no one ever wants to put on a poster again. I'll start with you, then I'll go to your mother's room, and then I'll find that brat of yours." Down the hall, in a room filled with stuffed animals and school books, 14-year-old Cheryl Crane sat in total darkness. She was a child who had been forced to mature in the shadows of her mother's scandalous life. She had heard the thud of her mother hitting the floor in previous weeks. She had seen the way Lana would wear dark sunglasses indoors to hide the shame of a blackened eye. But tonight was different. The threats weren't just about Lana, they were about the whole family. Cheryl stood up. Her movements were mechanical, driven by a state of dissociative survival. She walked down the back staircase to the kitchen. The kitchen was cold, the stainless steel surfaces gleaming under the moonlight. She opened the heavy wooden drawer near the sink. She bypassed the butter knives and the spoons. Her hand closed around a long kitchen carving knife. The blade was professional grade, sharpened to a razor's edge. She didn't feel the coldness of the steel. She felt nothing. She walked back up the stairs, the knife held flat against her thigh, hidden by the fabric of her skirt. Cheryl stood outside the master bedroom door. Inside, Johnny was screaming, I'll kill you all." Lana was pleading, "Please, Johnny, not in front of the child." At that moment, Johnny turned toward the door, intending to storm out, perhaps to find Cheryl, perhaps to leave. He threw the door open with such force it hit the wall with a thunderous crack. He stepped into the hallway, his chest heaving. He didn't see the 14-year-old girl standing there until it was too late. Cheryl didn't say a word. She didn't scream a warning. She lunged forward, using the momentum of her entire body. The 10-inch blade didn't just cut, it vanished. It struck him in the abdomen, fast and brutal. The injury was catastrophic, and within minutes he was dying. The sound was not like the movies. It was a wet, heavy thud. Johnny's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent "oh." He looked down at the bone-white handle protruding from his gut. He looked at Cheryl, then at Lana, who had collapsed in the doorway. He reached out a hand as if to steady himself and slid down the doorframe. The deadly protection of the Mafia had been ended by a child's carving knife. The legal proceedings that followed were less a trial and more a grand operatic performance. The Hollywood machine knew that the truth, a sordid affair with a mobster ending in blood, could destroy Lana Turner. So they crafted a masterpiece of public relations. When Lana took the stand at the coroner's inquest, she was directed by the best legal minds money could buy. She wore a high-collared black dress that made her look like a Victorian widow. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the jury with the eyes of a mother who had been to hell and back. For 62 minutes, she spoke with a precision that was terrifying. She recounted the deadly mechanism of Johnny's abuse. She described the fear that tasted like iron in her mouth every time he came home. She described the night of the killing not as a murder, but as a divine tragedy. "I saw my daughter," Lana testified, her voice cracking at the perfect cinematic frequency. "I saw her standing there, and I saw the man who had promised to destroy us falling. It was as if God had decided the nightmare had to end." The jury was mesmerized. They didn't see a woman who had brought a criminal into her home. They saw a white aristocracy icon who had been victimized by the black aristocracy. The verdict of justifiable homicide was a foregone conclusion. Yet the details left behind on that marble floor whispered a different story. Rumors circulated for decades that the adults in the room knew more than they ever admitted, but the official finding remained: justifiable homicide. Rumors swirled through the LAPD that Lana had been the one to strike the blow in a fit of alcoholic rage, and that Cheryl, the innocent child, had been coached to take the blame because a juvenile would never face the death penalty. Lana and Cheryl took that secret to their graves. They were free from the deadly protection of Johnny Stompanato, but they were now bonded by something much more permanent: the deadly silence of a shared killing. The blood on the carpet at 730 North Bedford Drive was cleaned within 48 hours. The mansion was sold. But for Lana Turner, the goddess of love, the performance never truly ended. She had traded a gangster's shadow for a daughter's lifelong trauma. The deadly protection had evolved into its final form: a mother and daughter, forever linked by a 10-inch blade, and a secret that not even the white aristocracy of Hollywood could ever fully wash away. As the echoes of the justifiable homicide verdict faded from the courtroom, a new sound filled the air: the rhythmic clicking of typewriters in Universal's executive suites. The men in charcoal gray suits had watched the trial not with horror, but with cold calculation. They saw that Lana Turner's goddess of love persona had evolved. She was no longer just a pin-up. She was a tragedy queen, and tragedy was the most tradable currency in the dream factory. The industry understood a dark truth: the public's sympathy is often short-lived, but their morbid curiosity is eternal. Lana was drowning in legal fees. Her reputation was scorched, and the IRS was beginning to circle like sharks in the water. She was vulnerable. And in Hollywood, vulnerability is not an invitation for help. It is an invitation for exploitation. The deadly mechanism of the studio system was about to offer her a Faustian bargain. They would save her from bankruptcy and social exile, but they would demand her trauma as payment. They would turn her blood-stained reality into a technicolor fantasy. The project chosen to resurrect Lana Turner was a remake of the 1934 film Imitation of Life. The director assigned was Douglas Sirk. the grandmaster of the Technicolor melodrama. Cirque was a man who understood the mechanism of the mask. He knew that if you saturate a scene with enough artificial beauty, lush flowers, glittering jewels, and soft, gauzy lighting, you can make the most horrific human suffering palatable, even beautiful, to the masses. The casting was a stroke of cruel genius. Lana was cast as Laura Meredith, an aspiring actress who sacrifices her relationship with her daughter for the sake of fame. The script was not just a story, it was a funhouse mirror of Lana's own life. It featured scenes of a mother and daughter screaming at each other in luxurious mansions, of a daughter feeling abandoned while the mother sought the deadly protection of the spotlight. Lana initially hesitated. She knew that to film this would be to perform an autopsy on her own soul in front of a global audience. But with the deadly debt of her lifestyle and legal battles looming over her, she had no choice. She walked onto the set not as a creator, but as a ghost compelled to haunt her own history for a paycheck. The filming of Imitation of Life was a masterclass in psychological masochism. Cirque intentionally pushed Lana to tap into her real-life guilt. In every scene where Laura Meredith neglects her daughter, the atmospheric pressure on the set would rise to an unbearable level. Lana wasn't merely acting out a script. She was undergoing a daily exorcism. There is a legendary harrowing account from the set during the filming of the climactic argument between mother and daughter. Lana had to hear her screen daughter, played by Sandra Dee, shout the line, "You've always treated me like a secret, like something you're ashamed of." The set went deathly silent. Lana didn't respond with her lines immediately. She stood there draped in a $5,000 Jean Louis gown, her face a mask of genuine, unvarnished agony. Everyone in the room knew that at that very moment, Cheryl Crane was being shuffled between guarded schools and psychiatric evaluations, effectively a secret that Lana's publicists were trying to manage. When Lana finally spoke, her voice wasn't the polished tone of a Hollywood star. It was the ragged, broken whisper of the woman who had knelt in Johnny Stompanato's blood. The director kept the cameras rolling. Every tear she cried was real, and every tear was worth millions. To ensure the film's success, Universal Pictures spared no expense in reinforcing the goddess image. They adorned Lana with a personal wardrobe of 38 different outfits, costing over $1 million, an astronomical sum for 1959. They used Jean Louis for the gowns and laid out an array of diamonds that required armed guards to be present on the set at all times. This was the commodification of chaos in its purest form. They were dressing a broken, traumatized woman in the world's most expensive shroud. The diamonds served a dual cynical purpose. They blinded the audience to the sordid, black aristocracy reality of the Bedford Drive murder, and they acted as a gilded cage for Lana herself. The industry's message was clear. As long as you look beautiful, we will let you stay. But in exchange, you must give us your tears, your guilt, and your private ghosts. Lana became a prisoner of her own aesthetic, unable to be a real mother, because she was too busy being a perfect imitation of one. When Imitation of Life premiered in 1959, it wasn't a standard film screening. It was a public forensic investigation. The audience arrived with a predatory hunger. They didn't want to see Laura Meredith. They wanted to see the woman from the headlines. They wanted to see if they could spot the deadly secret in the corner of her eyes or the tremor in her hands. As the film reached its heart-wrenching finale, a massive operatic funeral, the audience wept in unison. But they weren't weeping for the character on the screen. They were weeping for the death of Lana Turner's innocence. When Imitation of Life premiered in 1959, It became one of the year's biggest hits and Universal International's top-grossing release of the year, bringing in about $6.4 million in U.S. and Canada rentals. But the victory was hollow. Lana had traded her privacy and her daughter's healing for a box office resurrection. She had proven that Hollywood would forgive any sin, even a killing, as long as it could be converted into a profitable melodrama. While Lana was being celebrated as the comeback queen, the real-life collateral damage, Cheryl Crane, was drowning. The success of the film only served to amplify Cheryl's trauma. Every billboard she saw, every magazine cover featuring her mother in those million-dollar diamonds, was a reminder of the night she held the 10-inch blade. The public didn't see Cheryl as a hero or a victim. They saw her as a plot point in Lana Turner's grand life story. The relationship between mother and daughter fractured under the weight of the deadly secret. They were now two women living in a mirror maze. Lana looked at Cheryl and saw her own failure and the lingering shadow of the black aristocracy. Cheryl looked at Lana and saw a woman who had used their shared bloodbath to buy more furs and more fame. The deadly protection that Cheryl had provided that night had backfired spectacularly. It hadn't saved the family. It had turned the family into a brand. Lana continued to live as the goddess, but she was an imitation of life herself, a perfectly constructed image with nothing but echoes and cold marble at the center. By the end of 1959, the blood on the floor of 730 North Bedford Drive had been successfully converted into the highest earnings of Lana's career. She had survived the gangster, she had survived the trial, and she had survived the box office. But in the quiet moments when the Jean-Louis gowns were returned to the rack and the diamonds were locked back in the safe, Lana Turner was still that 15-year-old girl from Idaho, realizing that in Hollywood, the only thing more dangerous than being a failure is being a success built on the sacrifice of your own child's peace. As the 1960s bled into the 70s, the white aristocracy that had birthed Lana Turner began to crumble. The old studio system, which had once acted as her deadly protection, was being replaced by a gritty, uncompromising new Hollywood. In this new world, the polished, over-dramatized glamour of the 1950s felt like a relic of a distant, more superficial age. Lana Turner, the woman who had once stopped traffic on Sunset Boulevard, found herself becoming a ghost in her own kingdom. She retreated into a life of high-walled seclusion. The woman who had been possessed by the black aristocracy and commodified by the white aristocracy finally chose to possess herself. She moved into a luxury penthouse in Century City, a fortress of beige silk and crystal. But the silence of the penthouse was often interrupted by the echoes of the past. The deadly mechanism of her life, the cycle of searching for a protector only to find a predator, had finally exhausted her. She stopped marrying. She stopped searching for the father she had lost in the gutters of Idaho. She became a gilded hermit, living amidst the furs and the diamonds that were the only things that had never betrayed her. In the early 1990s, Lana Turner faced an adversary that couldn't be charmed, sued, or outacted. She was diagnosed with throat cancer. For a woman whose identity was built on her physical perfection and her seductive, smoky voice, this was the ultimate cruelty. The disease was a relentless internal black aristocracy, an invader that began to dismantle her from the inside out. She underwent grueling radiation treatments. The goddess of love was now a patient in a sterile hospital room, stripped of the Jean-Louis gowns and the million-dollar lighting. Yet, it was in this period of physical decay that the real Lana, Julia Jean Turner, finally emerged. She faced her illness with a stoicism that shocked those who had only seen her as a fragile screen icon. She refused to let the world see her broken. Even when the pain was unbearable, she insisted on her makeup being perfect. She was performing for the final, most demanding audience, death itself. The most profound development in Lana's twilight years was the slow, agonizing reconciliation with her daughter, Cheryl. For decades, they had been separated by the deadly secret of the Bedford Drive murder and the imitation of life comeback. They were two survivors of a war that neither of them had started, but both had fought. As Lana grew weaker, the walls between them finally began to thin. They stopped being a star and a problem child and became simply a mother and a daughter. Cheryl, who had spent years in the shadows of her mother's scandal, became her mother's primary caregiver. In those quiet hours in the Century City penthouse, the deadly protection was finally replaced by genuine love. They spoke about the night of Good Friday not as a headline or a plot point, but as the tragedy that had bonded them forever. The 10-inch blade had cut deep, but the years of shared suffering had eventually acted as a suture. On June 29, 1995, Lana Turner passed away at the age of 74. She died in her own home, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had been more dramatic than any movie ever filmed. The news of her death was greeted with a global outpouring of nostalgia. The white aristocracy mourned the loss of their last true queen. The black aristocracy of the past had long since faded into the history books, but the story of the goddess and the gangster remained as vivid as the day it happened. Her funeral was not the operatic spectacle of imitation of life. It was a private affair, but the image she left behind, the blonde hair, the white mink, the eyes that had seen too much, remained etched into the cultural consciousness. She had survived the mining towns, the studio bosses, the mobsters, the trials, and the industry's hunger for her soul. Looking back at the life of Lana Turner, we see a story that is more than just a celebrity biography. It is a cautionary tale about the price of the American dream. Lana sought deadly protection because she was a woman living in a man's world, a world that viewed her beauty as a resource to be extracted. She traded her peace for glamour, her privacy for power, and her daughter's innocence for survival. The lasting significance of Lana Turner is the reminder that behind every goddess is a human being struggling to survive the very system that created her. She lived at the intersection of Hollywood's highest aspirations and its lowest depths. She proved that you can wear $1 million in diamonds and still be terrified of the dark. Her life was a masterpiece of survival, a testament to the fact that even when the mechanism of possession tries to break you, there is a part of the human spirit that remains untouchable. The knife became a grim piece of evidence, photographed and archived as part of Hollywood's most infamous case. The mansion at 730 North Bedford Drive has seen many owners since 1958, but the story of Lana Turner remains a haunting echo in the hills of Beverly Hills. It is the story of a girl who wanted to be protected, a woman who was possessed, and an icon who finally found her own voice in the silence of the end. Lana Turner was the queen of glamour, but her true crown was the strength it took to stand in the light, even when she knew the shadows were watching.